I'm going to talk about quantitative risk assessment for information security. Okay, and enjoy the pictures because a lot of my slides are quite verbose. So, anyone know what the talk's about? No, could be. Some of you studied for CISP, haven't you? You got your CISP credentials.
Are you a camera member?
No. No. Ale? Yeah. So it was a mystery to me what the origins of ale were. So I thought I'd look them up for you. Hope you'll find it interesting. Will be a sort of historical development. Mainly a battle between Americans. Okay. So I'll be talking about some of these gurus in the world of computer security originally. And then, do you recognise this place? Exactly. So we'll end up with some probabilistic risk assessment. Okay. So, do you know who these guys are? This is taken in the late 70s, before my time. But anyone recognise these guys? No? Come on, these are the stars of information security, computer security. So let's start with the guy on the left. Is Bob Courtney, an IBMer, and I would say he is the father of quantitative information security risk management. And let's just see how influential he is. So he published in 1977 this conference paper, Security Risk Assessment. I think it's worth going through this and an example from that paper, because this is, although this is 1977, 40 odd years ago, this is still what the field is about. So let's be clear. And if you thought that cyber risk insurance was a new thing, he's even talking about insurance there. So he's interested in the selection of security measures appropriate to bring the risk within tolerable limits at the lowest cost, selected on the basis of cost-benefit. And to do that requires quantification, and you're trying to lessen or eliminate security problems, risk reduction, in other words, by paying for security measures. And so you need to quantify the risk to measure the benefit. And he gives a procedure. And an example taken from the paper, and sorry, I've just copied and pasted it, so it's not readable, but he's talking about catastrophic loss of a facility. So what are we going to do about that? We've anticipated the problem, so maybe we need a hot site, warm site, whatever they used to call them at that time. And so some figures. Suppose that the cost of such a loss was estimated $150 million. Then what does that tell you about how much you can spend on doing something about this risk? Well, you actually have to have an estimate of the frequency that this might occur, and here he's got 0.003 per year. In other words, what, once every 33 years? Okay, and then he says, well, multiply the two together, get $450,000, and that's the amount of exposure that you should be willing to spend up to that per year. So this is the kind of fundamental idea. And what could you do? Having done that analysis, you could tolerate the risk, you could actually take some measures, pay for a warm site or whatever, up to that amount, or you could try to make it less likely to occur in the first place. Okay, put sprinklers in or something like that. So he's saying that if you hadn't quantified the impact and the probability of occurrence, then you wouldn't be able to make an informed decision. And he's also talking about insurance not being a fourth option in the sense that it provides a means of smoothing the impact of the loss when and if it happens. I'm not quite sure what he means there. I think he's saying, well, you're actually going to probably spend more on insurance over that time than the cost of the event. If it occurs once in 33 years and this is over a 50-year period and so on, it's insurance companies have to make money. So I think it's in that sense. Anyway, it's a minor point. So how was this paper influential? Well, Bob's work was taken up by, what's this called? Department of Commerce, National Bureau of Standards in the States, in this publication, FIPS Pub 65 in 1979, Guideline for Automatic Data Processing Risk Analysis. And this, I believe, is where ale is first mentioned. It may be, presumably it was used by actuaries as well, but perhaps not under this name. And so the idea, as we were discussing, is that loss is given by the product of impact and frequency of occurrence. Of course, we're approximating and we're estimating here, and impact, he believes in doing it in dollars. Okay, you have to dig to find the paper. So that's fine. Generated a lot of excitement, but people struggled with it a bit. I mean, they struggled because coming with an estimate for the probability, an estimate for the cost, it's difficult. Not so valid. Let's take it, but let's see another example. Contrast fire with misuse of resources. There are two different risks. Fire being a low frequency event. It's also a high impact event. Misuse of resources, high frequency, low impact. So it's the opposite. If you estimated the impact of fire being 100 times that of misuse and the frequency of misuse 100 times that of fire, well, when you do the product, you get the same value for ale. So it's saying that if ale is summarising the risk, it's saying that these risks are the same magnitude. Now, managers may actually disagree with that. Are there information security managers here? Presumably, yeah. You will presumably want to spend substantial sums to avoid or prevent a devastating fire, and you will probably only be willing to pay for some awareness programs and other little things to prevent misuse of resources. You don't really care about minimal loss. So you've got to be careful about these formulae and ignoring the underlying impact. Right. While we're on anomalies, let's take a couple of anomalies to do with risk matrices. Because none of you are using ale, I'm sure. If you're doing any risk assessment, you're probably doing qualitative or semi-quantitative risk assessment and creating heat maps or risk matrices. So a guy called Tony Cox wrote a paper in 2008. He did a lot of research around there about risk matrices. And the first anomaly he came up with was that risk matrices can assign identical ratings to quantitatively very different risks. So let's see if you understand how risk matrices work. First of all, let's consider risk A, likelihood of 2%, so that's once in 50 years, impact of $10 million. So let's see where it goes into this risk matrix. where we've got likelihood ranging from frequent to improbable, impact from negligible to catastrophic. This is semi-quantitative in that we have actually given some ranges so that people have some idea what we mean by these terms. So 2%, that is seldom, and 10 million, that's catastrophic. So it fits in this little pigeonhole where it's a sort of medium risk that's been decided. Let's look at risk B. 20%, still seldom. 100 million, still catastrophic, same pigeonhole. Okay, but look at this. If you do the L calculation, so you get stuck looking at a screen. 2% of 10 million is, what is 200,000, and 20%. Okay, this is 20 million, or you can say the likelihood 10 times that, impact 10 times that. It's 100 times riskier, two orders of magnitude, but we put it in the same pigeonhole. Okay, this is the range compression anomaly. Okay, it's not very satisfactory. So we thought, oh, we're being a bit precise, we should put some ranges here. But they're too wide and it's not very good. It doesn't tell us that much. Even worse is that risk matrices are worse than useless, according to Tony Cox. But this is the problem. They can mistakenly assign higher qualitative ratings to quantitatively smaller risk. Again, it's the same risk matrix. Take two examples. 50% of 9 million, I can do this one, is $4.5 million, and 60% of 2 million, 1.2 million. So risk A is a substantially higher risk than risk B, but look what happens when we map it out. 50% goes into the likely category, okay, and 9 million goes into the critical category. Have I got these figures wrong? And 50%, okay, just fits in the occasional, so it's there, and we've actually reversed what it should be. Okay, these are taken from this book, which talk about at the end. Okay. So these risk matrices are misleading. Here's the antagonist. Turns out to be Don Parker. Have you heard of him? Yeah. So he's a leader in Leading Light. I think he got famous for actually writing the book that he hadn't published at this point in time about computer crime. And he was from SRI. And skip forward a bit of time, and he reflects on the history of the field, and he talks about risk reduction is not a viable objective in information security because risk is not under our control, can't manage it, can't measure it. It's produced by unknown enemies. We don't know who they are, what they're thinking. We don't know their skills, knowledge, resources, access, authority, motives, objectives. Don't know what they have against a particular company or a particular government organisation or the 1.2 billion people or whatever on the internet. What you are able to control is security and some of your vulnerabilities, and it's a battle between Don and the quantitative risk assessment people, by which he meant Bob Courtney and Bill Murray and others. He actually has the utmost respect for these people. If you read it, but he does sort of at an academic level have a sort of a philosophical difference with them, and claims that what they're trying to do is impossible, basically. So What about this guy? This person has got the mutton chop sideburns. The best sideburns in computer security is Dan Gear, yeah. And so he was writing in 2003 about the future of information security belonging to the quants, okay, probabilistic risk assessment. So he was very much in Bob Courtney's camp. So if Don was dismissing risk analysis, risk management, what was he proposing? Well, he had these generally accepted security principles, things like that, which we can understand to be security baselines. Baseline in the sense of a set of controls. This is a paper I dug up by South African Rousseau von Solms. He chaired the IFIT working group 11.1 at the time. Steve Fennell is the chair of the technical committee IFIT TC 11, yeah? And this working group is still part of that technical committee. Anyway, so this is an academic, and he asked the academic question, can you sort of have these sets of security controls which are a good fit to any organisation, and if you have that, then you don't need to do risk management, maybe, or not in any formal way. And in his paper, he refers to Code of Practice for Information Security Management, the BS 7799, which we all know evolved into ISO 27001 and 2. So this was essentially, the part one was a list of controls or control objectives. And by 2017, are we talking about these being a baseline? Well, no. If you read it, it says resources employed in implementing controls need to be balanced against the business harm likely to result from security issues in the absence of those controls. The results of a risk assessment will help guide and determine the appropriate management action and priorities for managing information security risks and for implementing controls. So in this recommendation itself, this standard itself, it talks about doing a risk assessment. But there are, I mean, it may be fine, you just use those controls, good guide. There's what my colleagues tell me is if they're in a position where they're doing information security management, they will quite likely look at SIS controls. That's a popular set at the moment. I think it's from SANS. And the claim here is relatively small number of prioritised, well-vetted, supported security actions, and the organisation can take to access and improve their current security state. And this is now, instead of talking about what should my enterprise do, in other words, doing a risk assessment, what should we all be doing? So that's the kind of philosophy behind that. So if you're a technology person and you're not into risk, and that's presumably pretty much 99.9% of people here, you may want to take the easy option and take a baselining approach, but then your organisation may have its own specific risks that you haven't really identified. And there's also, you may want to do this and then do a risk analysis for the critical parts of the organisation. So they're not exclusive approaches. Right. Back to Don Parker. He published a paper back in 2006, replacing risk-based security. So he's going on about this, and there's a section, invalid risk-based security in practice. And there's this lovely anecdote that he tells there. So one CISO told him that how he performs risk assessment. He does it backwards. So he knows what he needs to do for the next 5 years in order to have adequate security, creates some risk numbers that support his contention. He then creates types of loss incidents, frequencies, impacts, producing the numbers that he needs, refines them, so it all seems plausible. This is beautiful, isn't it? Are you doing this? Yeah. Don says this is unethical, it's all fake, but the CISO was offended and said that Don didn't understand. The numbers are understood by top management to be a convenient way to express the CISO's expert opinion of security needs. Okay? So CISOs, they're experts, they know what the risks are, they've got the experience. This is a fair comment, okay? And this is just a way of presenting it. Okay, what we'll find is that the subjective opinion of CISOs can be used in a quantitative approach, but they don't have to do everything in their head. Okay, so it isn't as unreasonable as it seems. So let's now turn finally to something more recent. Anyone come across this book? A few of you. Have you read it? Yeah. Good. I've read some of it. I started reading his other one, I thought, How to Measure Anything in whatever. And that I got a bit bogged down, and then I thought, well, it's nearly time to give this talk, so I actually started reading this, and this is much easier. So I'll give you the gist of it as I see it. Oh, look, the foreword is by Dan Gear. Okay, still around. There's a co-author who's an information security professional, so Doug Hubbard was able to tailor what he was saying about how to measure anything to this specific area. Okay, and that's Doug, by the way. He looks like a consultant, doesn't he? Yeah. So what's the basic idea? It's representing uncertainty about the impact of an event. That, as far as the impact is concerned, it's modelled as a random variable with a probability distribution. Okay, so you have various values for impact, each with a different probability. So Doug, he proposes, well, how do we get a reasonable probability distribution? He proposes eliciting a 90% confidence interval, so it's a lower bound and an upper bound from an expert, so someone who, so from the security expert who knows the business, and that expert is saying he believes there's a 90% chance that the impact will be between the lower bound and the upper bound. Okay. Now, if the risk analyst doesn't trust one expert, wants to consult lots of experts, can do that, and in Doug's experience, having checked that all these experts understand what they're being asked to do, sometimes they'll misunderstand, you can just average what they say for the lower bound, what they say for the upper bound. That's as good as anything, apparently. Other things to improve their estimation is to provide some training, little multiple choice tests and things like that. And he thinks of the experts as instruments, and he wants calibrated instruments. And he's trying to correct for underconfidence or overconfidence. So overconfidence, he says most of these experts will be overconfident. They'll come up with a narrower range than is reasonable, and they need a bit of practice. Okay. And other improvements in the book include decomposition strategies or factorization, which is the factor in the FAIR methodology. Okay. And other things, you can take data into account and apply Bayesian methods. Okay. But you can still get a first cut model by simply eliciting two numbers like that from your experts. Okay. The thing is that there may be estimates to start with, but you're not applying sort of hokey methods to those figures. That you're manipulating them in a mathematical way. So what about the probability distribution itself? And that's kind of the elephant in the room, I would say. It doesn't make that much of in the book about it, certainly not in the original book. There's an appendix of different probability distributions, and he suggests that if you're modelling the impact of a cyber attack, then the log normal distribution is pretty good for that, because it's only, and that's what the curve looks like. So it only has positive values, which is right. Your loss is going to be some positive number, and it does allow for extreme events, so very high impact. You can truncate it if you want. It's easy enough. Right. And then you are coming up with this confidence interval that 90% of the cases are going to come in there. So if the event occurs, there's a 90% chance that it will have an impact, say, this is by 200,000 up to 2.3 million, whatever. Okay, so here's a little example. Now, the nice thing about Hubbard's book is he shows you how to do everything in Excel. You don't have to buy some fancy specialist software. So here's an example. Let's suppose the event has a 5% chance of occurrence, and the confidence interval you're given by the expert is between $1 million and $9 million. Then what you do is create this formula, and it's basically saying, so we have a random number. If it's below 0.05, in other words, 5% of the time, then the impact is given by this formula here. And when the event doesn't occur, there's no loss. Okay? So this formula here is the inverse of the cumulative log normal distribution. You put in a probability here. This is upper bound plus the log of the upper bound plus the log of the lower bound divided by 2. So it's the average of those two, and this. So that's the mean, and that's the standard deviation for this particular distribution. And this will give you a figure, sort of, if you simulate this, you can get a reasonable value, a plausible value, okay, with it. Now, if you follow what I just said, can you solve this puzzle? What would be the value? Oh, let me just do it on here. What would have to be the value here for the log norm inv to give you the lower bound? That's it. Because there's a 5% chance of impact being below the lower bound. So it took me, I was really puzzled about this, and suddenly the penny dropped. And then I checked it on Excel. Yeah? And then the other one for the upper bound, if this happened to be 0.95. Okay? So that's a sanity check, if you like. Okay? So let me just, before I do go on with the calculation, here's another example of a probability distribution that might be applicable to your situation. Say if you're worried about earthquakes, and something called a power law distribution, and that ensures that catastrophic events, which are rare, will be given non-trivial probabilities. Okay. So anyway, back to, so we've got an idea how to model the loss. So suppose we've got a list of events we're worried about, called unimaginatively by Doug AA down to ZN, whatever. And each of them has a probability of occurrence, and each of them has a, we've got a confidence interval, and we've selected our probability distribution, say log normal, and then we plug the formulae into Excel, and voila, the random numbers are produced, generated, and it so happens in this run that this particular event didn't occur, so we've got a 0. This event did, and happened to be within the confidence interval. These ones didn't. This one did. You could imagine that rarely you will have something which is higher than 10,000 or lower than 1,000, 10% of the time. So you've got all these random numbers generated, creating these impacts, these losses. You add them all up. Okay, that's one simulation. And as Doug explains, there's a convenient facility in Excel, a sort of a what-if analysis, which you can, and that will enable you to do 100,000 simulations at the click of a button. Normally, what-if analysis, you change an input value, but here there's no need to change anything because it's on each run the random numbers are newly generated. So you end up with 100,000 different losses. Okay, that's an example of one, and then you plot them. So, and what you plot is called a loss exceedance curve, and there are two here. So this one here, so-called inherent risk, that would be where we've considered our events and probabilities and impacts without any controls, or perhaps with our baseline controls. Okay, which is more sensible. We've decided we must have these controls, or we've got them in place, and we'll move on from there. So you've estimated your probability of occurrence or likelihood of occurrence and your impact based on the current situation. You've got lots of values coming out of that Monte Carlo simulation, and you've averaged them. This curve is basically, it's an interpolation of lots of points. In this case, it's plotted on log scale, but that's not important. It could be a linear scale if you wanted, just display purposes. And so you can read this as, say, the probability of a loss exceeding $1 million is 67%, or exceeding $100 million is 15%. Okay, that kind of idea. Now you're thinking about putting some controls in place, particular controls in place. That's going to be changing your probability of occurrence, your impact potentially, and so you rerun the simulations and get in exactly the same way and get a so-called residual risk curve, which is obviously going to be dominated by the inherent risk if these controls are at all effective. Now the other curve here, so-called risk tolerance, and that involves actually eliciting more information from senior managers, the board, whatever, and it's saying, well, perhaps unusually saying, are you prepared to lose $10 million a year 40% of the time. So a loss of exceeding 10 million 40% of the time. And maybe you ask them 80% of the time said, no, that's too much, but I wouldn't mind that loss 40. So they're deciding how much risk they can tolerate. And so we see that the original inherent risk was fine up to here, but it was too high, this part. So the idea of putting some controls in place was to get below the tolerance level, and you see we've succeeded here. Okay. So this is something nice that you as the CISO can present to senior managers, and they can make sense. So that was it. So just to conclude that quantitative risk assessment is intended to help with decision making. I've introduced some of the characters, Bob Courtney, Dan Gear, and there are 2 must-read books on the subject. They're in the canon of cybersecurity from Palo Alto Networks. They won the award in 2014 or 2015 and 2016. So people like these books. And I haven't really talked about this is the FAIR book by these 2 guys. Notice that whether you're going back 40 years using ALE or you're doing probabilistic risk assessment, loss is determined by the likelihood and impact of the events being analysed. And in Doug's book, that's showing how to do these calculations in Excel, plotting loss exceedance curves, and he's saying these are much better than risk matrices for the reasons I've given. Okay, thank you very much.
Do we have any questions? Ladies and gentlemen, we do have a question over there. I'm going to do my runner with the mic set now.
Hi there, I'm Andrew Yeoman, CISO of Arcit. It isn't really a question, I'm just using this as a plug, but for those people interested in the FAIR Institute, FAIR Risk, there is a FAIR Institute and there's a UK chapter which meets monthly mostly in London. It's not very well marketed, but it's run by the son of Jack Jones, Ryan Jones. And if anyone is interested and wants more details to come along to this, free of charge, just come along, talk risk and enjoy yourself.
Thank you. I like that kind of question.
So following up, has anyone got a question? We have a hand at the front. If we pass it forward to the microphone here. Is the mic working?
Hi, I'm not sure if this is a question or a statement, but perhaps I'll phrase it as a question. The challenge I've had in trying to establish quantitative risk assessment methodologies at an organisation which is far more familiar and has got an established heat map, risk grid type risk assessments, is the executives won't understand it. Now, I find that, to be honest, pretty offensive that we're saying, these senior people are incapable of understanding anything other than a red, amber, green representation of anything. But I'm just wondering what your thoughts are that at the end of whatever method you use to do your loss expectancy, you have to almost make it into a cartoon or the side of a bus before senior management can understand it.
Yeah. I think one thing, is the point made by Doug, is to try and present things in the same way or use the same methods as are used in enterprise risk management. And there's too much sort of bespoke stuff for the cybersecurity area, and we don't have to do. So the senior management are looking at all different kinds of risks, particular operational risk, and we should be sort of presenting things in the same way as other guys for doing other kinds of risk. Also, this is the statistical stuff is all very daunting. It is for me. I'm not a statistician. I'm not a quant. But a large enterprise will have its risk people specialising in these kinds of analyses, and you should be working with them, and they can apply their methods to your situation. And then it's perhaps being explained to senior management in a uniform way, that in the same way that they have other risks, other operational risks to consider. They can consider information security risk.
Chance for one more question or a quick comeback.
Yeah, I take your point, but that rather assumes that the other risks are also being represented in a meaningful way, and not just red, amber, and green. And does it really? Are you really going to run your business on? I've got 2 yellows and a green.
Well, I mean, I think in the FAIR book they, which I haven't read, they do. They're not so against risk matrices, heat maps, and so on. But they say you do your quantitative stuff, and then you convert it in the end into the matrix, into the heat map. Okay, so you're confident that you've been as precise as you can, or as you need to be, and then when you present it, okay, you give a more abstract view. Okay, so I think that's and just remember that you're just doing this for decision making. Do we go for these controls? Do we go for that? Is it worth investing in this fancy new technology or what have you? So you don't need exact figures. Just give it. It's just to avoid having to rely on your intuition all of the time. It's a tool to help you. Okay.
Okay, ladies and